For this year, this is our first webinar, and we intend to organize webinars every 2 months. That is even months of the calendar. So we have one today. In June, we will have the next one in August, and invitations will be sent out to all of you. Then we'll have another one in October, and the last one for the year in December, and then we'll continue next year. So what I would like to do now is introduce the speaker, Geoff Huston, and Geoff Huston will speak on the topic of trust and security on the internet. Geoff Huston is the chief scientist at IPNIC, where he undertakes research on topics associated with the internet infrastructure, IP technologies, and address distribution policies. From 1995 to 2005, Geoff was the chief internet scientist at Telstra, where he provided a leading role in the construction and further development of Telstra's internet service offerings, both in Australia and as part of Telstra's global operations. Prior to Telstra, Geoff worked for the Australian National University, where he led the initial construction of the internet in Australia in the late 1980s as the technical manager of the Australian Academic and Research Network. He is the author of a number of books on IP technology and has authored numerous papers and columns. He was a member of the Internet Architecture Board from 1999 until 2005 and served as its executive director from 2001 to 2005. He is an active member of the Internet Engineering Task Force, where he currently chairs 2 working groups. He served on the board of trustees of the Internet Society from 1992 until 2001 and served as 10th chair of the board in 1999. He has served on the board of the Public Internet Registry and also on the Executive Council of IPNIC. He chaired the Internet Engineering and Planning Group from 1992 to 1995. In 2020, Geoff was made a member in the General Division of the Order of Australia for his role as the pioneer of the Internet in Australia. So over to you, Sunny.
Did you mean to say over to Geoff?
Either way, thank you, Sam.
All right.
And let me share my screen here. Look, in my case here in Australia, it's afternoon, and so good afternoon. It, of course, may be in a different time zone where you are, and wherever you are. Look, hi. It's really good to be with you today. I want to share with you some impressions about security, and it'll take just a little over an hour. I'll keep the Q&A window open. If thoughts cross your mind as I speak, type something in the Q&A and I will try and respond as you do so. Otherwise, we'll deal with some other questions at the end. But what I would like to do for about the next hour or so is to talk about the foundations of security in the internet. The internet is no different to any other communication system. You're communicating with someone you've never seen. You don't know. How do you know you're communicating with the party you intended to? Now, if it's just a conversation, you go, oh, well, maybe it's the wrong person. What does it matter? But sometimes it's more important than that. It could be your bank. It could be the traffic light management system for an entire large metropolis. It could be important infrastructure. How do you know that you're going to the right place? What makes the internet trustworthy? And so I'd like to actually look at the foundations of trust and security here, or perhaps more relevantly, look at why it's so broken. and talk about this topic from the opposite direction of looking at how has it all gone so horribly wrong and why is it so difficult to get this right? So let's start with a really typical picture. In this case, it's a bank. It's a website for a bank. If you are in Australia and have ever gone to the Commonwealth Bank, this kind of page layout might be familiar. You all, I suppose, do internet banking one way or another, and you all work on the feeling that what you see is what you get. So it certainly looks like my bank, and I certainly hope it's my bank, and I'm about to log in and give it my username and credentials, but do I know that I'm really communicating with my bank? What clues are there to point out that this is really the bank I intended to go to and not some dastardly plan to separate me from my money? Look, it's really easy to mock up a web page to look like any other. So this kind of look and feel that you get on the web page, that's nothing. So I typed in combank.com.au and I kind of trusted the internet to connect me with my bank and bring up a page that's familiar. But there's no reason why I should trust that page, because it's really, really easy for someone to intercept and alter that conversation, isn't it? Why should I trust this? So, let's get down to the real thing here. Why should I enter my username and password? Why should I enter my credentials at the bank into this web page? And what you actually notice if you blow it up a little bit is that there, right beside the name, is this little gray padlock. What does that mean? So let's pull this apart a little bit and look at what I did and what happened. My browser, when I typed in www.combank.com.au, my browser connected to the DNS libraries on my platform. The DNS libraries then did a DNS resolution, and back came an answer. In this case, it was an IPv4 address, 23.214.88.232. Great. And then my browser opened up a TCP connection with that IP address. And it was actually going to open up a TLS connection, a secure connection. And so the port that it's going to use is TCP port 443. Now, 23.214.88.32, that's a good place to start. Let's ask the DNS for the reverse of that IP address. What's the reverse? That's interesting, because this IP address doesn't belong to the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. No. It belongs to Akamai. Now, the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, if I look up who is, has two entirely different address blocks. So I'm not going to a website that's operated by the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. I appear to be going to somewhere operated by the Bank of Akamai. And I'm not a customer of the Bank of Akamai. And so now the question gets more interesting. Why should I trust that this IP address, 23.214.88.32, is really the authentic website for the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, even though it's operated by a hosting company? So why isn't this an evil scam where the evil scammers have actually contracted Akamai to be their front end? How do I tell the difference? And more to the point, I suppose, how did my browser tell the difference? And why should I trust my browser? What's behind that padlock? So, as all things around security, how can you tell the difference between a truth and a lie? And that's a tough enough question. But more to the point, how can I automate that decision process so that applications working only on algorithms can make that decision between truth and a lie on my behalf without any sort of human-guided intervention here? So that's the question that really is being posed when I go to my web banking site. Why is that padlock coming up? Why should I believe that padlock? And so to answer that question, you actually have to unwind this and actually start talking about cryptography. And as usual in this case, it is all about cryptography. Now, cryptography is, a very, very old thing. It's been around for hundreds, thousands of years, and trying to create ciphers which is unintelligible to everyone else, but the intended recipient can decode it, has always been the trick here. For a long time, what we tried to do was make all the intelligence in the scrambling algorithm. And if you've ever looked at the Enigma machine history in World War II, it's all about the algorithm itself as a mechanical system being at the heart of this. But we moved on a little bit, and in particular around just after the end of the war in the UK, and then later on in America, about 30 years later, they started to work on a system called public key cryptography. Now, public key cryptography is a special kind of cryptography where if you encode a message with one key, the resultant scrambled ciphertext can only be decoded with the other key, the matching key. And equally, if I scramble a message with this key, it can only be decoded with that key. So it's a pair of keys that share a very, very unique relationship. But it's even more special than that. If you know the value of this key, that doesn't help you with the other key. You can't tell the pair by just knowing one. So why do we call it public key cryptography and not just key pair cryptography? Because what you actually do is take those two keys and keep one a very closely guarded secret and tell nobody. That's your private key. The other one, you paste up on the wall. You make it as widely known as possible. That's your public key. And what you're trying to do is to advertise that that key is synonymous with you, and that anything I encrypt with my private key that only I know the knowledge of, if you could decrypt it with my public key, then it's me. So what kind of a relationship do we actually exploit in this? And interestingly, this is thousands of years old. The sieve of Eratosthenes, an ancient Greek, I believe, or these days I think we'd call them an Italian. They were down in the southern part of Italy. And it's a prime relationship that a number m, any message m, any integer, raised to the power e, raised to the power d, is isomorphic to m if you do a modulus n. So you have three numbers now, e, d, and n, and you're using prime number exponentiation. And the trick is, as long as both d and e are relatively large, and n, sorry, d and n are relatively large, and n is the product of two very, very large prime numbers, then if I want to know d when I already know e and n, it becomes really hard because I've got to factor out n where there's only one solution, two very, very large primes. And because this is a very, very large number, finding those two prime numbers is computationally difficult unless I already knew one. And that power of primes is what drives this, because there's only one way to do prime number factorization, assuming you don't have quantum computers at all. There's only one way to do this, and that's by enumeration. You just churn through numbers, 1, 3, 5, 7, off we go to see if, any of them are a factor here. And because they're very, very large numbers, this just takes time. And this is the issue with most cryptography. It's not that the message is impossible to crack. It's not that you can't find that relationship. It's just infeasibly difficult with current computing. And as computing gets better and better, you better keep on picking bigger and bigger prime numbers to make sure that it's still infeasible. So all of this about cryptography is getting the defender to perform just enough work so that they can make it secret, but the attacker has to perform so much more work that it's infeasible. And it's not just my message to you today that I want to protect, but I'd like to protect it in a year's time or 5 years' time. So I have to worry about not only the amount of compute power that an interceptor might bring to that message today as to what's computably infeasible, but I've got to worry about next week or next year or further on in the future for as long as I would like that message to remain some kind of a secret. So the way this works in keys, if I have a copy of your public key and you encrypt a message with your private key, then I can decrypt that message. This is great. In fact, anyone with your public key could decrypt that message. But it's more than that. I actually know two other things which are really important. Only you could have sent it, because only the holder of that private key can send this message, which is successfully decrypted with the public key. No one else could. So you sent it. And secondly, you can't deny it. It really was you. It's almost like this indelible signature. Once you've signed something with your private key, you have signed it. There's no going back on that. So you can't deny it. There's no revocation going on in the cryptography itself. So this looks all pretty good and pretty solid, but there's kind of a weakness. How do you know my public key? You've never met me. You haven't gone around to look at what I pasted on my wall. You know, how do you know whose public key it is? And how do you know it's not someone pretending to be me? Because, like I said, don't know you, never met you. I have no clue, neither do you, whose public key is whose. And so what we have to do is bring in intermediaries. In the legal system, we call these public notaries and various other forms of office holders with a worthy reputation who sign a document because they've been blessed as being a public notary. And as long as we understand who those notaries are and trust them, we can trust everything they sign. And so the same way we use intermediaries here. An intermediary has contacted you, for example, validated your identity, done some kind of proof of possession test that you have control of a private key and that matches your public key. And then the intermediary signs an attestation that this is your public key. And they sign it with their private key. So now, if I trust that intermediary and I understand the processes that intermediary went through to actually perform the validation of you, then I can trust your public key as yours as well. Think of it as a kind of a passport, where you go to the passport office with a photo, with some signed attestations that it really is you. You go through a proof of possession test, and out of it all, you get a little booklet called a passport issued by your government. As long as other governments trust your government, then we have an identity document that everyone should be able to trust, as long as those initial steps of validation are robust. Same thing is going on here in the digital world through these intermediaries. So the intermediary signs this attestation, a public key certificate, using their private key. I trust that intermediary. They're saying it's your public key. I can trust that. That attestation is what we call a public key certificate. And it's a purely digital thing. Here's one here. Now, this is what happened when I clicked on that padlock using Safari. And what it said was, the reason why the padlock appeared is that you're opening up an encrypted connection to this domain name, www.combank.com.au. And what you actually find here is a couple of things. Firstly, there's a subject part of that public key certificate that was issued by a company called DigiCert. It was issued, or sorry, it expires in about a year's time, 23rd of July, 2022. It was issued to a company who said that they were the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but what I do know is that DigiCert believes them. So DigiCert reckons it's true. Now, DigiCert resides in the US. DigiCert has done a certificate, and they've actually issued this on the 25th of June 2020, and it's a 2-year-long certificate. So that's part of the reason why I think this is trustable. Let's have a look at a few other certificates just to see the difference in detail. Because the first one, of course, has, this is the Commonwealth Bank. Here's an organization, a unit, a common name, all these details about the party that was issued the certificate. For my website, www.potteroo.net, I'm cheap. I didn't pay DigiCert. I didn't pay anyone. I went to Let's Encrypt and paid nobody. It's free. And now potteroo.net is the subject of that certificate. There's no organization. There's no name. My name doesn't appear. Nobody's name appears. And it's kind of, well, someone owned potteroo.net at some point, so Let's Encrypt issued a certificate. Great. That's about all you know. It still binds the public key to a domain name, but it doesn't say who it is behind it. And oddly enough, there are a number of different kinds of certificates out there. And here's an exercise, spot the difference. There are 3 domain names, each of which I've gone to using Safari and Chrome, and I have picked up the padlock. They're all the same color. There's no green anymore. No one understood green anyway. And so it's all either gray or black. They're exactly the same icon and all the same form, aren't they? Well, no. The first one we know was the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. DigiCert issued that certificate, and it was issued to an organization called the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. Right? The one at the bottom, potteroo.net, Let's Encrypt issued it, and it issued it to somebody. None of us know. Can't tell a lie. It was me, but there's no evidence in that certificate. The one that's in the middle is kind of interesting. This is APNIC. And if you go to www.apnic.net, as I did, and have a look at the certificate, what you actually find is it's issued to an organization called Cloudflare. There's no mention of APNIC. So, yeah, right. If you look hard, you actually find that it's a mess. That there are 3 very, very different kinds of validation going on here to what we call extended validation that looks at the identity of the organization and their bona fides with that domain name. Ones like Let's Encrypt, which are proof of possession on the day at the time. Good enough, not brilliant, easily fooled, but good enough. And the one in the middle by Cloudflare, which is kind of, what is going on? Here's a website over in Cloudflare land that has the only relationship with APNIC is kind of the domain name. There's nothing else. So it's a mess. But, you know, TLS still works, right? Well, let's look at TLS. TLS is TCP++. And the whole idea about TLS, previously used to be called secure sockets layer, is that you bring up a TCP connection and then you use a one-off session key just for this session. And that one-off session key is used to encrypt traffic in both directions. Now, once the session is torn down, that session key is discarded and never used again. And each new session key. So it sounds pretty good. But of course, obviously, the weaknesses are at either, you know, at the front end when you're trying to set this up. Now, this is TLS 1.2. TLS 1.3 has a few changes to make it faster because everyone worries about the, you know, $1 billion millisecond or whatever. But here's the interchange that goes on. The first, once you set up the TCP session, CNNIC, the next thing the client does, you, the browser, to the server, is to say, I support the following versions of TLS. If you can't do any of those, we're kind of dead. And also, of course, there's not one cipher encryption algorithm, there's a bunch. And there's not one compression mechanism, there are a bunch. And so what the client does is say, well, I can speak the following cipher languages. I can do the following compression algorithms. I can support the following TLS algorithms. There used to be a really good bug where one of the cipher algorithms that it would support was none. So you're running TLS unencrypted. Bad idea. Anyway, the client says, here's what I can do. The server says, well, here's what I think is the best of that selection that I choose to do back. So there's a TLS version, a selected cipher algorithm, a selected compression mechanism. And in that server hello, the first response, it sends its certificate. That's the server hello is now done. Now what the client does, because it now has the public key of of the server, is that it creates a session key. And it encrypts that using the server's public key that only the server can decrypt. And it sends that session key over. And so now we're getting to the point of going, right, let's now do a change ciphersec finish. We decrypt that message using the previous keys and off we go. We're now inside a secure session. These days, there's one more thing that happens in that client hello, which is not obvious here, which is servers now host hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of different names on the same machine. So as well as the TLS version and the list of ciphers and the compression mechanism, in the clear, the client offers the server name, the SNI field. And even if everything else is encrypted, any eavesdropper who sees that client hello sees precisely where you're going. So encryption works to a point. Now there's work underway to try and even plug that hole with encrypted client hello, but the work is difficult and there's not much uptake and it's unclear how quickly that will get taken up. So anyway, onto this connection. The server's public key and that pre-master key is of course based on the certificate. And here is that certificate again for the Commonwealth Bank. And what you see inside that certificate is indeed right there, the public key, that 256 byte number. There's the exponent and the key size. Now, the Commonwealth Bank is pretty diligent and it's keeping with current US government standards, NIST standards. So the key size being used for this session is 2048 bits, big. The current feeling is that any key that's 1028 or less is now too small and can be decrypted, and can be broken with enough computing power in feasible time. And so 2048 is about a minimum. So the Commonwealth Bank is doing a decent thing here, encrypting with a relatively powerful RSA algorithm. Good-o. So now I'm being presented with a certificate in that server hello. And now the real question for me, the browser, when I'm looking at this certificate is, well, how do I know it's the right one? Why should I trust this certificate? Because when I actually look at that certificate again, and let's go back to that original page, you see also that little green tick and the bland statement that this certificate is valid. Yeah, why? How did it know that this certificate is valid? That the Commonwealth Bank had indeed gone to DigiCert, because Robbers Inc. might have tried to fool DigiCert and successfully fooled them. So how do I know it's the Commonwealth Bank? How do I know that this is the right certificate? So all this happened without my knowledge. I wasn't a party, but this is what DigiCert claim happened. DigiCert are claiming that the Commonwealth Bank of Australia generated a key pair. They passed a certificate signing request over to DigiCert. They passed other credentials saying they really are the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. And they also passed money. And in exchange for money, and probably not much else, they published a certificate that said the entity is called the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, and they have the control of the name www.combank.com.au, and they have a certain public key. Now, if I can associate that public key with a connection, then I'm pretty sure that's www.combank.com.au, right? But now I'm trusting DigiCert. And I'm prepared to trust DigiCert because DigiCert never, ever, 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 ever lie. But how do I know that they never, ever, ever lie? Why should I trust them for every single certificate they ever produce? Well, DigiCert aren't the only one. In fact, if you look inside your machine and look in the security areas of either your browser or the platform, then what you actually find is that there's a whole bunch of folk that are trusted to never, ever, ever lie. Now, Hussein Niandala, I hope I've got that name right, Hussainia, says there are instances where certificate authorities were fooled and they issue certificates for evil actors. What mechanisms do we have in place to take care of such scenarios? I'll get to that, and it's not the answer you would like. Just wait, it'll happen. So here's a list of everyone that my browser trusts, and every single certificate they produce, it will trust, because trust is absolute. That's an awful lot of trust. Why does my browser trust them? Well, probably because of money. And the way it worked is all of these people joined an industry body called the Certificate and Browser Industry Forum. And they have, if you will, a code of practice. And part of that code of practice is we never lie. And our machines are perfect. And there's no such thing as a software bug, and no one ever fools us. Yeah, right. It's more about the intent than the action, isn't it? So let's just see where we are now. Somebody, and I've never met anyone from DigiCert, and I've never met anyone from the Commonwealth Bank in their IT department. So somebody paid someone, and I've never met either of them, some money, and then my browser trusts everything they've ever done and everything they ever will do. And that's the nature of trust. Now, there's another word in the English language called credulity, which is kind of trust taken to a point of incredible stupidity, to be too ready to believe that something is real or true when in actual fact it's not. Now, this is an old screen snapshot, but it has a couple of entries that I just want to highlight, who at the time were part of the trust circle a few years ago, about 3 or 4. And the first of these is CNNIC, the Chinese National Information Center run by the Chinese government. And it's in the root stores, or was, in almost every browser. So in March 23rd, 2015, CNNIC was pushed to issue a certificate on behalf of a company called MCS Holdings. They were an Egyptian telecommunications entity run by the government. So far, so good. The subject of the certificates that CNNIC issued just happened to be star.google.com, star.skype.com, and a few others of similar vein. So what this allowed is for someone, presumably MCS, could use that fake certificate to fool users in Egypt that they were really Google. And if they were able to intercept that traffic, then you would believe they were Google. The padlock would still appear. It would look good. And so they're not all trustable. Some CAs lie. Now, in the case of CNNIC, the lie was fatal. They were removed. And now there's no Chinese government certificate authority listed in your browser trust circles. Well, there better not be, because that would be bad. What about the next one? Komodo. They still exist. They're still around issuing certificates. Now, this is a little bit older. This is 2011, but they got hacked badly. Their online systems actually managed to be seduced and corrupted, and the public key for, yet again, star.google.com, the private key, sorry, was published. So anyone could actually mimic Google if they were on the wire, because sometimes the consequences are terrible, right? So trust goes bad. Now, I have a couple of questions here. So let's go to them just before I move on to what happens when all this goes bad. From Mayan. What about self-signed certificates? Where do they fit in? They don't. Self-signed certificates are never trusted by your browser. It should bring up a box going, this looks awfully suspicious. Don't
sorry, Geoff,
go there. Yeah.
Just sorry to interrupt you, but there are a few questions in the Q&A.
And as you notice, I am answering them right now. So I'm just answering from Mayan. And now I'm going to answer from the ISOC Delhi chapter, Prof. Kapil Goyal. For a country like India, generating over 1 billion certificates is a huge opportunity for security agencies. Well, it is and it isn't. Don't forget, it's only the servers that need certificates, not the clients or customers. And these days with Let's Encrypt, that's completely automated. So if you trust the mechanisms by Let's Encrypt, you don't need to do anything. If you want something more than that, you want to build it yourself and join the CAB forum and go through all that trouble and expense, by all means do so. But these days, Let's Encrypt has blasted that area as an area of activity. There's nothing left. I think the pragmatic answer is go use Let's Encrypt like everybody else. Because, you know, there has been bad incidents in securities. CNNIC is no longer a CA anymore. Interestingly, they got caught issuing certificates for things like example.com. Bad idea. That's what happened. Google then switched it off. If you look at Google's security blog, it kind of goes, we're no longer going to trust CNNIC as a CA, a bit like CNNIC. They said they'd never lie. They lied. Oops, not good enough. And of course, what happens with all of this goes wrong anyway? Well, here's the result of the Komodo hack, where the Iranian telecommunications agency, which operates a wire in the middle that connects all of Iran's domestic networks to the rest of the world, actually does interception. And they were trying to use that compromised key to tap into people's Gmail, which they could, because in essence, by owning a private key that you trusted, issued by Komodo in this case, the wrong issuer, then they could mimic Google and get away with it. Route 53 got rerouted for 2 hours. Why? Certificate hack. So why does this keep on happening? What happens when everything goes wrong here? Well, the issue is a weakness in TLS itself, because when the server sends you that public key certificate, you have no knowledge of whether the issuer was the right one. Any trusted CA will be trusted by you, the right one or the wrong one. Any CA can issue a certificate for any domain name, and you can't tell the difference. And, you know, as it says on the slide here, that's not just bad, that's awesomely bad. That's incredibly poor. So here's a lock on your front door. Looks like a great lock, but, you know, don't worry. Any key will open it. Any key whatsoever. That's how bad this is, because we actually don't know which CA is the right CA for each domain name. So what's going really wrong? You see, because any CA can issue a certificate for any domain name, there's no incentive for quality, because the entire certificate authority structure in the web is only as strong as the weakest one, not the strongest, the weakest. And so why pay money for a really fancy certificate when Let's Encrypt will do it for free? And no one, literally no one, can tell the difference. And quite frankly, there's an awful lot of trust out there. Credulity is the word. Your browser trusts normally between 60 and 100 CAs, and those CAs don't do everything. They have a whole lot of helper agents, what we call registration agents, subordinate RAs in the language of the CA world. And so you're trusting around 1,500 folk operating about 650 different organizations. And you're trusting that none of them ever have a problem, ever. Yeah, right. Akamai down this week, Fastly down the week before. Everyone always had problems. But you're trusting in the CA world that there are no problems ever, anytime. There's a question about blockchain coming up too. Give me a second and I'll probably get onto blockchain, but it'll take a little while to get there. So let's have a look at this again. Normally, quality is what works in the marketplace. But in this case, quality offers absolutely no protection. You're only as strong as the weakest CA. Which one you choose to use is irrelevant. The weakest CA can issue a certificate for anyone. So what wins in the marketplace is cheap. Cheap, 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 cheap. So it's all okay, isn't it? And someone asked a question here, which I now want to answer. When the certificate authorities are fooled to issue certificates for someone else, for bad people, what mechanisms do we have in place? Well, we have a thing called revocation. And the CA can issue a signed list of the index numbers of certificates that they're trying to suck back in to say, don't trust that one, it's really, really bad. And they issue this revocation list continuously every few weeks, you know, just every few days sometimes, new revocation list, bad certificates are revoked. And browsers, of course, always check on the revocation level of certificates. And, you know, do they? Do they really? Do they really check? Well, no. Some do, some don't. Sometimes, some applications. So I tried, and I actually wrote an article about a year ago because I was quite impressed with this. I have a website that I set up that the only way that you trust it is if you trusted a certificate that I'd already revoked. And so on the Macintosh platform, Mac OS, OS X, it was version 10 at the time, when I tested Chrome, Firefox, Opera, and Safari, they went, oh, you know, yeah, it does revocation. What about my phone? Well, interestingly, iOS got me to the site with security, even though the certificate was revoked. Oops. How about my Android 10 device? Chrome, yes. Firefox, yes. Opera, yes. In other words, none of them checked the revocation list. And Windows, well, it was a bit of a bet each way. Windows 10, if I used Chrome, the answer was, no, I'm not checking. Firefox, yeah, I'll check. Opera, no, I'm not checking. Edge, yes, I'm checking. So revocation doesn't really work. It's not a bulletproof mechanism to go, nah, don't believe that certificate. Because no one checks all the time. Some do, sometimes. Oops. So how can we fix this? How can we make it better? Now, the first mechanism we're trying is to rip all the money out of the system, to stop certificates actually costing money and be a luxury good. Make them free, make them open, make them automated. And the issue is this totally automated service making the environment better or worse? Now, if all I need to do is to fool a domain name registrar that I own your domain name for about an hour or so, and during that hour, I contact Let's Encrypt and get a certificate issued for the domain name that I've just stolen from you for an hour, and then I'll hand it back to you. You can have your domain name because I have a certificate that's valid. Then the damage has been done. And so free and automated and frictionless is also a lot more vulnerable than what it used to be. And so the answer with Let's Encrypt is, well, it helps and it doesn't help at the same time. So how else do we fix it? Well, one way is inside Chrome, if you have a look at the code, you will actually find pinning and a whitelist. And what Google says is that for these special domain names, including google.com, the only CA that can actually authenticate that certificate is listed here in the code. It's called pinning. But the problem with pinning is I can't list 1 billion domain names in the source code of Chrome. And so Google just lists itself and a few mates. And so it's kind of just Google protecting itself. Great to be Google running Chrome. Everyone else, well, you're on your own. We're not going to help you. So pinning doesn't really work in the code. An alternative is to put the CA in the content, in an HSTS record, and do the pinning that way, which again sounds really good until you realize this becomes a trust on first use. As long as the first time you access the content, it's the right one, then you get protection thereafter. But if the man in the middle can find your first access and give you something else, you're no better off. So trust on first use relies on the fact that the first use is protected, but it's not. So that doesn't work either. Are trust certificates via the browser? Does Firefox have a different trust group versus Tor versus Edge versus Chrome versus Opera? Okay, so let's unpin that question, Marianne. All trust certificates are either in the application or in the platform. Now, the Mac system provides a platform trust mechanism. The application you use is Keychain, and if an application simply wants to trust Apple and iOS, it will use the trust group that the platform has. But the application has its own decision to make. It can set up its own. So if it wants to, what it can actually do is create its own trust list. Now, all the browsers tend to have the same list because it's the CAB forum, but that can vary. And of course, the problem that you actually find in reality is that in doctored devices, such as mobile devices issued by your employer, they may have a few extra keys added to trust your employer's system and to allow your employer to look at all your traffic. So sometimes those platform-based trust lists of trusted CAs is actually deliberately corrupting trust to allow third parties to look at all your traffic. So it's not a very foolproof system, absolutely not. Is single sign-on related to CAs? Asks Maury. It is, insofar as the single sign-on page is protected. So in other words, you're running TLS. And so in theory, with a single sign-on, you're talking to the person you intended to talk to, establish credentials and so on through a TLS session. So anyway, back to where I was. Google fixes itself. Google protects itself and no one else. Google even runs its own trusted CA. So Google's protected Google and everyone else is out there in the wild. How else are we fixing this? By a thing called certificate transparency, where what actually goes on is that every certificate that gets issued by a CA is published in an irrefutable log. There's a question about blockchain. And what is blockchain? Well, the fundamentals of blockchain is a Markov keychain, where you sign over A, which signs over B, which signs over C, which signs over D, which signs over E. And that interlocking chain of signatures means that after the event, you can't change anything in any aspect of the chain because it's signed over by the next one and the next one and the next one. Certificate transparency is that signing chain applied in a more natural fashion. And it actually is a log of everything that was issued. So if I can fool a CA into issuing a certificate, the CA will publish that fake certificate. There will be a record. So if I try and be naughty, then my naughtiness is uncovered and will be found. Now, it sounds really good until you look at it when you realize it's not. Because in that fine print of that web page, it says there are structural flaws in the HTTPS certificate system. And that's true. There are structural flaws in this model. It's really bad. Vulnerable to compromise and manipulation. Absolutely. Google's Certificate Transparency Project aims to fix this. Well, that's a fail. Because what it relies on is kind of, hacks last long enough for folk to actually find it. Now, this is a case of same week service in a millisecond world. Assuming anyone looks. How did we find out that Symantec had issued a certificate to example.com? Well, it was inside a certificate transparency log. They got found out. How long did it take someone to find out that Symantec had issued a certificate for a stupid domain name? 6 months. So as long as the criminals move very, very slowly and take their time, and the hack lasts for months, we'll find it. But these days, a good hack lasts about an hour. And certificate transparency is about as useful as offering a bicycle to a fish. It just doesn't work. And in some ways, it's worse than doesn't work. It has all the appearance of working, but it's not. They're claiming that it aims to safeguard when in real time, in the real world, it safeguards nothing. I'm not Sheikh Mudsayam, I'm sorry, I've really mangled your name. But the question is, aren't all sessions have a first use vulnerability? No. The intent of TLS is that that certificate that's offered immediately sets up a secured session. And in essence, the system is as secure as the underlying CA system. So there's no first use vulnerability here. The issue really is one of trust in the certificate infrastructure, which is that's where it's all misplaced. So if the certificate infrastructure is misplaced, what can we do? Well, we can use the DNS, because I don't know about you, but in my world, the DNS answers everything. Whatever you want, the DNS can do this for you. So, you know, if I'm trying to find the public key for a domain name, why don't I just look it up in the DNS? Why not use the DNS for this HSTS pinning record? Why not query the DNS for the issuer CA? Just look it up in the DNS. In fact, why don't I just go for the public key itself? Why do I worry about all this certificate nonsense when the DNS should be able to do this? And if the DNS can do this, why do I need CAs? And that's a really, really good question. In fact, it's the question, because the IETF certainly thought about that question about 10 years ago and came up with a technology called DANE, Domain Keys in the DNS, RFC 6698. You really should read that, because what happens in this case is that you get this server certificate. In fact, you just get a key. And instead of then looking up your local trust list, and we know how bad that is, you look up the DNS and you validate against what you find in the DNS and do the key exchange that way. It's really cool, because now whatever the server sends, and it needn't even be a certificate, it can just be a key. You can then look up the DNS, find an answer, because you know which domain name you're going to. That's the domain name you started this entire session with anyway, and base everything else on what you found in the DNS. Sounds really cool, yeah? The problem is that if you didn't like trusting the CAs, you should never ever trust the DNS, because, you know, it's the DNS. And so we've got to fix the DNS. How do we fix the DNS? Well, it's called DNS Sec. This doesn't use certificates, but it's a very similar form of interlocking signatures. A bit blockchain-ish in some ways, but not quite the same way in Markov chains, where key chains are signed from delegator to delegatee, from parent to subordinate. So if I've got www.potteroo.net, .net is signed Potteroo, Potteroo signs www, and that's how it works. And so if I use DANE and DNS Sec, then I can get the TLSA record that I'm looking for, the TLS record, and ask DNS Sec to say, is that real? Is that genuine? Am I being hoodwinked? And I can validate the DNS answer to ensure that in the context of the DNS, it's not a lie, it's real. And so now I can accept this record of the key session based on the fact that if I control my domain name, the key is actually in the DNS as well, and everything is contained in the DNS. I don't need the entire certificate infrastructure. And the answer to all of that is it sounds good, but it really isn't that good. Oops. So what's the problem? I don't know if many of you have played with DNSSEC, but you know, you don't live long enough. It can be incredibly slow. And Chrome actually implemented this 10 years ago, almost to the day. 16th of June 2011 was when they took it out, actually. And what they found was, of course, that doing validation means you've got to actually go back up to parent to parent to parent to parent and perform an entire set of consequent DNS queries. And they take time. And that's time the browser doesn't want to spend. Now, oddly enough, we can make it faster. And here's one by Paul Wouters about 5 years ago, talking about the chained query requests. Because all those queries to find why I should trust this key, I can predict the queries. They're all queries that I know. So why don't I just give you the answers? And why don't I give you the answers before you ask? So why don't I just give you a set of answers in an extension in the DNS? Heaps faster. I can eliminate all the time and actually do this validation, right? Well, wrong, because as anyone has ever played with UDP, you can't put big payloads in UDP and expect it to work. So while chain query requests in the DNS sounds good, unless we all start using DNS over TCP, or in a very circular way, DNS over TLS, or in an even more circular way, DNS over HTTPS, unless you go into a transport protocol that can cope with big answers, this is never going to fly. And right now, the DNS world today is a DNS world dominated by UDP. So, you know, good idea, but it's way too early to do it. Or we can do it a different way. And we can put all that DNS information into the TLS itself as a bundled answer in that server hello. And then all the client needs to do is to apply the DNS root key against that and perform the key exchange. This looks really, really good. I'm inside TCP already. I can do this. I bypass the entire certificate mess and actually just put everything dependent on the DNS itself. My domain name, my delegation record, my keys. I have complete control. This sounds really, really good. And this is one of these frustrating issues where we could actually do a far, far better job of what we're doing. We could actually stop this mess that's called CAs and just get rid of it. We can actually DNS Sec sign everything, use these dang TLSA records, use DNS Sec validation, but put it inside TLS and use those TLSA records embedded as stapled products inside the server hello and staple that into the TLS exchange. And this would be really, really cool. But we knew this 5 years ago. Why haven't we done it? Why do we keep on getting these ridiculous security incidents when we know what a better job looks like and how we could do a better job? Why are we ignoring it? The internet's big, really big, and it's not run by anyone. It's run by all of us all at the same time. Now, the problem is that there are a lot of us and we all are doing it for different reasons. CAs are big business. And so a lot of folk who still issue CAs, like DigiCert, are working awfully hard to protect that business. So a lot of the existing CAs have no interest in seeing this business line extinguished. So they want to keep this strong hierarchical control of digital certificates because it entrenches their role. Some folk actually rely on being able to fake certificates. And every single enterprise network on the planet has toyed with the idea of snooping on their employees and makes it a point that that's critical for their enterprise role. And so some do this snooping and deliberately break security because they believe it's their business to do that. So it's very, very hard to make systems that are absolutely robust under all circumstances when a huge community of users over in the enterprise world is going, no, don't want that. We want to be able to break it, truly. Yeah, great. Other folks see it as competitive advantage. The problem is that other folk, like browsers, are also aiming for whatever's fast is good. If it's not fast, it's not good. Even if it's insecure, as long as it's fast, it's good. And that motivation of fast over better sort of compromises a whole lot of stuff. And while some folk are willing to take a second or two to validate the web page, browsers don't believe that. They think of the billion-dollar millisecond and go, it's all about faster responses. And if you look today at the work in Chrome and at the work inside Apple these days, there's a whole bunch of work on prefetch. There's a whole bunch of work on making it even faster. So on the application side, there is no tolerance for any time penalty at all. Security has to be seamless and has to be not just fast, but invisibly fast. No added cycles. That's really hard. So all these different goals create a really big set of problems. Why also is this hard? No one provisions the entire thing anymore. Folk make browsers, other folk make DNS software, other folk make validation software, and so on and so forth. I was young enough to remember the Saturn V launch vehicle. Now, you know, the last time that took off in anger was 1969. So that was a long time ago. But, you know, at the time in the 60s, this was an absolute masterpiece of technology. It had 3 million components built by multiple subcontractors, and each of which was provided by the lowest bidder. And so only by NASA did this work. Only because someone orchestrated the system did the system ever achieve liftoff. Because left to themselves, all of those contractors and subcontractors would never have built a functioning rocket because they all had different motives. And oddly enough, that's the internet. There's no orchestration. There's no coherence and consistency. Everyone works to further their own goals, almost in spite of everyone else. There's no consolidation and no tight coupling. And so because it's all loosely coupled, yeah, I'm working to close here very quickly.
All right,
that's
thanks.
what you're going to remind me. Because it's all loosely coupled, routing, name registration, certification, there's always going to be vulnerabilities. And so the market itself is the orchestrator, and that doesn't work. Now, we know what users want. They just want to trust the internet. They don't want a doctorate in network operational security. They just want it to work. But somehow we've made this incredibly complicated. We've put in a huge sort of middle industry of complexity, and no one actually wants it. That's what we've built. But the problem is, if we can't trust our communications infrastructure, we can't trust anything. This is a mess. This is dysfunctional. Will it get better? Well, we know answers in the DNS with DANE and DNSSEC. But the problem is too many people use too many weak keys in DNSSEC. It's littered with 102.4-bit keys and even worse. On-demand validation is unworkably slow. The DNS is never right. Everyone stuffs it up. And getting keys into the DNS just strikes a lot of critics of this as a recipe for complete disaster. If you thought the CA system was bad, at least there were CAs trying to make it better. In the DNS, nobody tries to make it better. It's just a mess. And it never will get better. The CAs, of course, has a problem that corrupted CAs is a constant problem. No matter how good you are, the computer systems you operate are vulnerable. And that idea of free certificates just makes it worse. And so that lack of robust pinning is just pervasive weakness. And the CA system is never, ever, ever going to get any better. So both approaches we've found have fundamental weaknesses that can't be instantly solved. That's a problem. So I'll take some questions now in the small amount of time available, and I'll read off some of the ones in the Q&A right now and see how far we go if anyone else has any questions.
Geoff, what we are going to do is, I think there's 3 questions in the chat. We'll take 2 more and we'll wrap it up because we have already gone past the hour.
Sure. Does paid antivirus internet security software like Kaspersky identify which web pages to trust? No, not at all. All it does is look for signatures of virus software, and it's an entirely different area. Malware can, if it gets certificates, just as easily as goodware. And so, you know, the antivirus software doesn't really help there. I'm sorry, Alan, no go. Does the proposed solution the same as DOE or builds on top of DOE? The solutions around DANE are independent of the transport mechanism used by DNS. So in some ways it's independent of DOE, but if you try and put stuff in the DNS, the answers get big. If the answers get big, it's hard to do it in UDP. And so to make the DNS more useful, we've got to put bigger things in the DNS, and that means we've got to use a reliable transport. Now, if you're going to use DNS over TCP, you might as well use DNS over HTTPS, because the marginal cost between TCP session establishment and HTTP session establishment is tiny. The big cost is getting to TCP and reliable transport. After that, it's all kind of free. Is there little chance of the internet being totally safe ever? Well, I'm driving to the fact that yes, there's little chance of the internet being totally safe ever. Because quite frankly, this model of dispersed trust with either a highly decentralized model of trust, the CA system, or a highly centralized model of trust, the DNSSEC system, both have incredible points of vulnerability. This highly centralized point of trust has a weakness right at the top. Single key. If that fails, all is lost. Oops. The highly decentralized model of trust, oddly enough, means if any of them fail, the entire universe is unsafe because any single CA can issue a certificate for anybody. So a single failure actually becomes universal failure. And so neither of these answers are very good. Is there any effort to fix it? Well, now this is interesting, I suppose, in some ways. As a user, you won't pay more for a secure solution. You won't pay the time penalty. You won't pay the cost penalty. You like free, fast software. And free, fast software is insecure. As long as you keep on liking free and fast, you're going to have to live with the answer. And the answer is what we've got. It's not very good. I like it works and it's really fast, but it has this continuous problem of being incredibly hard to make secure. And with that, I think I've abused your time long enough, and I'll hand it back to our session host. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Geoff. I think there is a raised hand by Dayalan N. Do you want to ask a question, Dayalan? We cannot hear you. If you can ask that question in the Q&A. And okay, so that's it. No more questions. Sorry, Geoff, we have got 3 more questions in the chat and we will wrap up after that.
Okay, well, I'll very quickly answer these 3 questions then. So is a decentralized internet the only way to go forward? Well, it depends on which country you're living in. Some countries would certainly prefer a more centralized internet that gives a lot more control. Other countries think that's the worst possible internet to have in terms of civil liberties. It's a tension that we really cannot resolve easily. And the question is, I think, more political than it is technological. The internet we have is heavily decentralized and loosely coherent. This is the model we're using. And quite frankly, other models may be explored, but it's not the internet. The next question. Why do Tor networks exist knowing that it's a nebula of threats? Is it because privacy always wins over damage due to threats from origin, or is it because I need to watch and learn when threats emerge? Why do Tor networks exist? Well, Tor networks are meant to actually hide both you from the network and even from the server you're going to. And so you can make privacy a number of ways, but normally when I go to a web server, I expose my identity to that web server. And if I don't want to do that, I actually want to wrap it up and put a proxy in between me and the servers I go to so that the server doesn't know who I am and the agent in the middle knows who I am but doesn't know where I'm going, which is kind of what Tor does. And we see it coming back again in a model called oblivious DNS. And we're going to see it come up with Apple in a model about oblivious web surfing and oblivious servers. Then privacy is important. And if you want that kind of privacy that hides your identity almost from everybody, including the folk you visit on the web, then you go down this path. But that's a subtly different model to a model of trusting where you're going to. This question of am I going to where I'm meant to go to still exists, no matter how much my identity is hidden. Does the firewall system and operating systems have anything to do with encryption and internet security? No, absolutely not, unfortunately or fortunately. The firewall system is basically all about putting signatures on incoming packets that are probably suspect. And whether it's packets that are fragments, whether it's packets to port numbers that aren't open, packets to things that look like malware or probing, firewalls are there to get rid of it. But firewalls operate at a very low level. This whole issue about, am I going to the place I intended to go to, is a much higher level question. It's an application level question. And it's all about the mapping of names and identity to my intention as an application. And firewalls are incapable of sorting that out. It's just at a much higher level. So those are the questions. Again, I'll hand it back to the session chair. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope it's been interesting.
Thank you so much, Geoff. It has really been interesting, and the questions that we have been getting from the audience indicates that they have comprehended whatever you were trying to present us, and they have got a good understanding of whatever you presented to us. In addition to that, the questions are another indication that you have done well. And we thank you for all your efforts, for being here, and hopefully we could count you again to educate and inform us on something more exciting later in the future. And thank you for all the audience. As I have mentioned earlier, that we will have this in all the even months of the year. So we had this one in June, and the next one will be in August. We will send you an email indicating the topic, time, date, and everything. And then in October and in December. Thank you everyone for attending, and see you again. Take care and keep safe.